Here, we'll start it again. All right. Man, I still don't have you trained. You all stand up.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's see if I can actually start the meeting now with the four-way test today, because I like to mix it up. I don't want us to always be the same. So will you lead us in the four-way test, Greg?
Oh, sure. Is it fair to all concerned? Will it be goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned?
All right. Thank you. That's how we start today. Okay. We are actually sitting down, visiting Rotarians and guests. Doesn't look like we have one.
We have our guest, Matthew Marshall, from the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and he's going to be our program today.
Excellent. Anybody else? All this work. Recognitions. Please continue to send in recognitions. We're not getting a whole lot, but we're getting better. Travel. Anybody traveling anywhere? Anybody returning from traveling anywhere?
You go first. Okay. Hers is much more exciting.
I took the kids back to Michigan. My mom and my dad have a little cottage right on a little lake. It's Michigan. It's kind of right here in the lower peninsula. My husband stayed back and worked, so I had the kids on the little lake. We did paddleboarding and kayaking, and then we spent a week in Chautauqua, New York, on the lake there as well. And we went to the Chautauqua Institute and got to hear some amazing history lectures, and the kids got to go to the oldest Boys and Girls Club in the nation, and it was pretty fun. So back, and school starts on Monday, and I'll be ready, I think. I have some.
I think that may be the first time I've ever heard the word Chautauqua.
Chautauqua, yes, Chautauqua.
Excellent.
And I traveled to Santa Cruz to meet up with my niece's host family when she was on exchange in Paris. It was delightful to see her and them talking with their hands like this and just laughing constantly. I went on a roller coaster that I wanted to go on since I was a small child, and I should have probably done it then. I went with the father of the family, who I found that screams are the same in both English and French, and it was a lot of fun.
I drove out for a week of fly fishing in Montana. I've been going to the same spot off and on since I was 2 months old in the Yellowstone area. So and my parents were there for my dad's birthday. They drove out, my brother and his wife and my nieces. My wife flew up to Bozeman for a weekend from New Orleans, and my sister and brother-in-law were there. So we were in the same campground we've been going to for 42 years.
Right,
Anyone else traveling?
fish.
Oh, I do have some pictures of some really nice fish.
You should send those in. We'll show them to everybody. Adopt a highway.
Woohoo! Tomorrow morning, yes, 9:30 out at the Humboldt Coastal Nature Center. It needs it. We haven't been out for a little while, so you'll get your fill of lots of cleaning of the highway. And then we'll go to Rita's in Arcata afterwards for a little volunteer celebratory action there. And so I hope many of you can come out. It should be a great day. Also, if you're out in the Manila area, they're also at the community center. They're putting up the new playground, which is pretty cool, and inviting all community members to that. And you can see I was in Little House A yesterday for my first meeting with all the lights. Everything's done. So the Family Resources Center is up and running. So great.
Howard, do you perhaps want to say something about the coastal trail cleanup? I put it on. The Hammond Trail. So, if you don't have to say anything. I
I'm organizing the September 22nd trail work. I think maybe it's
I ended up getting this, and I assumed that that's what it was. So anyway, if anyone cares, there's a lovely trail cleanup. So, and it's not one that Howard's associated with. So I guess this is mine. This is my favorite thing. I don't know why I like the Rotarian of the Week thing so much, but it's just really fun. Earlier I said thanks for being here, Andreas. I guess it's because it's you. So you're the Rotarian of the Week this week, and this is a setup because at some point, Chris and Lisa are going to be the Rotarians of the Week because they're the host, they're the host family. Yeah. So somebody else in this room could easily get the title of Rotarian of the Week. All you have to do is be a host family. You want to make a pitch for that, Ian? I waited to make sure I waited till you put food in your mouth.
Thank you. I know that Finn will get a moment to tell us about our last weekend, which will open up everybody's minds to it. But I met my new daughter, Mavi from Brazil this last weekend too. And I don't get to host till second, so I'm a little, lonely without the kid in the house again. So we're excited and waiting.
Nice. All right. Announcements. Anyone have things to say?
I just want to let everybody know that Taste of the Holidays is about 3 months away, and I did send a save the date out to all of our food vendors and beverage vendors. So I'm going to be giving you more information in the next month, and we'll be setting up meetings in September for anybody who wants to participate. So I thought I'd let that you know. It's Thursday, November 15th this year.
You go, Chris. I think we're talking the same thing.
Wait a minute. Today's the horse race day. Now, let me get this straight. I'm at work. I look at my boss. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I say, I'm not feeling too well. I think I need to go home. And I turn around. As soon as I get out the door, I get ready to when you sneak out the door, and you go join your Rotarian friends at the horse races, and bet on horses, have a great time. 3 o'clock is when the first post race starts. So
307.
3:07. I don't want everybody here early. I'm an on-time type of guy. All right. So anyway, look at your clocks today. Check at 2 o'clock. Think about it. Tell the boss you're not feeling well. And get out the
door. President Ray, I just want to point out that your decision to highlight the four-way test this morning is really interesting in light of what Mr. Hemphill is suggesting that we do.
A little four-way test is medicine.
It's fair.
Do we need to do the four-way test again then? Is this in the proper spot? You didn't put it this morning.
You can go a little bit to that side.
Can you just ask them to, do you want me to place a bet for you because I'm going?
There you go.
Wow. Yeah.
That's next week's one.
All right, so that is the RISE event that's tomorrow, and then also put on your calendar November 9, and that's going to be the Out of the Darkness Walk to raise awareness, education, resources for the American Association of Suicide Prevention. That's the one. So we'll be gathering right here on the plaza. It starts at 9. They need volunteers. I think the walk starts at 10. But again, just to come out together and to support families and communities affected. We do have one of the highest suicide rates in the nation, and we need a lot of support in raising funds for education and prevention. So hope you'll join the team. I will send out another reminder to join the team virtually, and even if you just gave 10, it would be amazing. Give something, be part of it, whether you can be there or not.
And I have 2 quick announcements. One of them is personal. I have an art show at the Humboldt Cider Company. Not this Saturday, but next Saturday on the 1st. It's my first art show. So I'm going to drop those flyers off. And then thank you, Rotary, for helping sponsor the Parent Project this year. I'm going to have flyers. I'm going to drop them off at everybody's table. If you have a business families come in or you frequent a bank, if you could ask them to put it up in their window, that would be wonderful. The classes are starting October 18th. It's an 11-week series. It's a great class. It's a great resource for families, officers, mental health, and it's where families can get resources. It's one of my favorite parts of my job, so if you guys could help me out and pass along the word, I'd appreciate it.
All right, we got some mail from the Wheelchair Foundation, so I'll pass these around so everyone can see what our donation does. Anything else? All right, I put it on the board and I figure this is the easiest way to do it. Finn needs a bike. Finn doesn't need 12 bikes, but he needs one. So, if we can organize, if someone has a bike for Finn, please contact me. I'll make sure Finn gets the bike. That work?
We're going to go look at a bike that Karen has this afternoon.
Okay. So, we'll make sure that you get a bike.
It was a Karen's. It was a Karen's.
Speaking of
It might
you
be a
getting a
little
bike.
small, I don't know.
It could be. We'll find the bike for you.
Ray, I actually do have one more.
Oh no, see, now I have to do this. We have to be back on the announcement slide because
So-
we're slaves.
Next Friday is Final Friday. It's also going to be a day of collecting donations for the Transitional Age Youth Clothing Closet. So you can bring any kinds of clothes that you're trying to get rid of that are cleaned and pressed, and any kind of toiletries or anything that youth might need that might be homeless or transitional between housing. Thank you.
If you send a notice out.
I'll send
before-
an email.
Yeah, just before.
Perfect. All right, so you guys might figure this out based on the last question about Finn getting a bike. There's some shenanigans clearly going on in this picture that happened at a rafting event. And I don't know if anyone can tell there's a similarity between the person who looks like the biggest troublemaker in the photo and someone sitting in this room. So I'm just gonna let you guess who that might be. So, on that note, we're not gonna go to a craft talk because I didn't put in my next slide, but we're gonna let Finn talk instead because I have a bunch of slides for him to explain. Come on up, Finn. There you go. That one right there. And oh, you want the actual photos up? Oh, that's too easy. That's too easy. Let's actually make that happen. Have we discussed this before? I might have been the worst IT guy in the world. Hey, I put it into slideshow form. All right, well, while I talk, Greg, why don't you do a song and dance? Because you wanted to be president this morning, so let's just, keep it exciting.
Oh, you 2-year-old fly fishing.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go.
Nice work, Greg.
Save.
Yeah,
Save.
you're saying that, Greg, but boy, we're saying that even
Yeah, I
more.
know, exactly.
Yeah, so I will talk a little bit about my week and what I did and also about the weekend. So first we often went to the beach with Lila, with the dog, and she loves to play there and have fun, so picture. And then we also went to the Acada Community Forest and take their walk. It was, for me, very impressive to see all the kinds of redwoods and yes. And it is not the right direction of the days because this was yesterday. There we went to a farm for meeting, not for meeting, like for dinner, yes, and they plant a lot of fruit, like vegetables like paprika and tomatoes. Yes, and also flowers.
This is my picture. I put this one in here.
Oh, good job.
Little dog.
It's thinking. Maybe.
We have more trouble
Well, apparently we decided to kill the computers. There we go.
Yeah, okay. So, this picture was after the weekend when we arrived on Sunday, and Andreas and I went to the cinema and looked to the movie Alpha. The first time in an American cinema. Now I will talk about the weekend. So this is an Aussie exchange student from the other countries. Yeah, and and it was a rafting trip to the river, and the house was pretty nice. Like up there is a pool house with a pool, and in the garden, this is a garden from another house where a big, huge garage is with a big kitchen, and it was a lot of fun. And now the rafting trip. Yeah, it was so much fun, and we started a lot of splash wars. So it was cool. And yes. And this was my first time in an American supermarket, and it's a little bit different.
That's the way they all are here. All of them are the same.
It's a little bit different to Germany, but not so much. Yeah. And also, Jen and I, so my house mom, we went often surfing, and this is our trip to the beach, and then we go surfing. Yeah, and this is a picture from yesterday's evening where we have dinner together with friends from the farm. Yeah. Yes.
They can't open that picture. I think we're going to just keep going with that.
I think.
Well, excellent.
Yes.
Are you ready for the second week?
Yes.
Excellent. You know, I think I told you I wasn't going to make you come up here and talk for a few weeks.
Yeah.
So, you're doing good. Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bear with me. Decided to kill the computer. We won't start the meeting again, don't worry. All right. So, I know it says craft talk, but I've had two people who were competing who really both wanted to do their craft talk. They were super enthusiastic about it, but we couldn't decide which of them should do it. So, we're going to skip it.
It wouldn't be fair.
It wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair. We didn't want to make them fight about it.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
Jennifer was very nice. Crystal, you know, she decided that she'd sit over there because she was upset over the whole thing. But they were both fantastic. So thank you guys. It was great. We'll get you both soon. So today's program. Oh. Just let
There we go. All right. So Matthew Marshall is the executive director of the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, which many of you are aware of, and he's come and spoken before. And last night I said, oh, hey, Matthew, you want to send me a couple sentences, or do you want me just to wing it? He says, oh, go ahead and just wing it. So I'm going to wing it. What if I told you there was an odorless tasteless, smellless gas out there that can provide you with power. Air, yes, exactly, if properly manipulated. So, so Matthew is the executive director of RCEA, and I had the pleasure of participating on a review committee looking at proposals for the development of offshore wind energy. I don't know why I was put on the committee, because I know what wind is, and I know what the offshore means, but I had no knowledge beyond that. It was fascinating to read through these proposals and what's going on, and so that project is moving forward, and I thought it'd be really cool to have Matthew come and update us on that. So Matthew, come on up. I won't go into your biography because I'm just make up stuff. We've had some shenanigans in our past, so we'll just leave it at that. Matthew.
Thanks for having me, and you heard what I'm going to talk about. Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, we're a joint powers agency of the County of Humboldt, all the cities in Humboldt County, as well as the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. And we've been around since 2003, doing energy efficiency programs, renewable energy programs, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, things like that. And so one of the new endeavors that we're working on is the offshore wind potential here in Humboldt County. So if you look at a map, this map is of the wind energy generation potential for the entire country. And if there's a little scale at the bottom, that the best is blue, red second best, and purple, yellow. And so if you look at that map, where there's the biggest blue splotch in the entire country is offshore of the North Coast. And so we have basically the best wind resource potential of anywhere in the country. Now, it's offshore, and it's offshore of the West Coast, which adds sort of two complications. One, there's not a lot of offshore in the United States as far as offshore wind. It's pretty common now in Europe and other parts of the world, but it's just getting going on the East Coast. There's the first project on the East Coast went in, it was operational last year. There's others in the queue, so it's starting to take off on the East Coast. But on the West Coast, the challenges are water gets pretty deep pretty quickly. And so the typical offshore wind farms you see are just fixed bottom, so they're attached to the seafloor. But in our area, to be able to do it, it would have to actually be like a floating platform technology, and that technology is just kind of reaching prime time and becoming commercially available. And so that's where there's increasing interest in the West Coast for offshore wind. And so because that technology is really now being commercially deployed in Europe and has been sort of proven out through testing and research efforts, both the federal and state government are interested in the coast of California as a potential area for wind development. But the Department of Defense made this map. Everyone thought the first projects were going to be down where there's population centers and lots of grid infrastructure. And then the Department of Defense said, we think these red areas are not so compatible because we're doing testing, we're doing training, and there's a lot of that going on in the central and southern coasts of California. And so the only area they left kind of green in their initial map was the North Coast. And so that started getting us a lot more interest from industry, and as well as state and federal officials saying, okay, well, if this is where the Department of Defense feels like there's the least conflict, maybe this is where we should be looking first. So people kind of all sort of started looking up this way instead of down south. I think the Department of Defense is going to ease up a little bit down south and not just redline everything, from San Francisco and beyond. But this certainly kind of catalyzed some near-term interest, overlapping obviously with the fact that we do have the best resource up here, but we don't have this transmission infrastructure or big population base to use a lot of energy. So, the scale of what might happen up here, at least initially, has to be a lot smaller than it would be elsewhere. So as far as what does a floating wind turbine actually look like, there's different types of platform technology that people are developing, but it's not science fiction. These things are actually happening in the world now. So there's the kind of the left, the first full-scale commercial project went in off of Scotland, and it's using kind of a similar technology on the left. There's these other kinds of platforms, and the one we're looking at is basically the one in the middle, because that's best suited to be able to be deployed in our area. The sort of one on the left is the other one that's the farthest along, but it kind of takes certain crane vessels, and the deployment of that works in Europe where they have the right conditions and the right equipment, but on the West Coast that would be a lot trickier, and Humboldt Bay wouldn't really be well suited to that. So we're really focusing on that middle technology. And here's what it looks like in the real world. That's an actual photograph from Portugal of one of the first pilots that was tested for, I think 5 or so years. It went through the full life cycle of being deployed, being operated, surviving 60-foot waves, and then being decommissioned and taken back out to kind of prove out that whole life cycle. And so this is the company that makes that platform in this picture is the one that we're working with. And this was their first project in Portugal that this picture is from. They're deploying, they've got 3 more projects in the queue right now in France, Portugal, and Scotland that are going in, starting this year actually, for 2 of those. So it's in Europe, again, it's being implemented at scale, and they're looking to now look at the US market. So the companies that we were working with, and as Greg mentioned, we issued this request for qualifications for development partners because we wanted to have a process that was more locally driven and not just saying, well, let's let all these big European companies duke it out and see which one wants to do a project here, and hopefully they'll do it in a way that is considerate of local fishing interests and the environment. And so we wanted to be a little more proactive in that, since that's something we've really heard from the community is folks want projects to be developed in a way that kind of aligns with our community values and needs and what we want to see. And so we said, hey, who wants to actually have this be more of a true partnership with the local community? We got 5 developers responded that all are multi-billion-dollar companies from Europe. I mean, we had one from Portugal that is EDP Renewables that we ended up selecting along with other team members. There was one from France, Germany, Denmark, Norway. So the companies that are doing offshore wind are typically European companies, and these are all companies that are doing this in the world and have hundreds of these turbines operating and have tens of billions of dollars in the bank. So the interest in this is quite real, and I would say these European companies are pretty bullish about the US market for offshore wind. And so the companies that we are working with, though, EDP Renewables is a large wind and energy development company based in Portugal, but they have projects all over the world, in the US and California. I visited one of the wind farms before we knew that we were working with them in Indiana. The other 2 companies, Principal Power is actually based in the Bay Area in Emeryville, but all their work has been in Europe, and they're the company that does basically the yellow part in this picture. They're the platform design company, and that's really adapted from oil and gas industry technology and just scaled down for a wind turbine. So it's kind of taking something that's proven and existing and adjusting it to this context. And then Aker Solutions is a Norwegian-based company that works all over the world. I think they're like 110 years old, and they build crazy stuff in the ocean. So undersea cables, offshore oil platforms, those kinds of structures. And so they're well qualified to actually do this kind of work and successfully pull it off, because it's not it's no small feat to build a 600-foot floating turbine out in the ocean and have it function properly. And then as far as on the kind of environmental consulting side, H.G. Harvey & Associates is a local firm that was part of the team that we selected, as well as Herrera Environmental Consultants from up north, and they've got a lot of experience with the offshore renewable energy permitting process that we'll have to go through. So one of the things that's most exciting about this is the renewable energy piece of it is a cool part of it, but the potential for Humboldt Bay is pretty exciting in that the harbor here has a lot of the right characteristics to actually be a hub for this kind of development. Initially that would start out with assembly and maybe fabrication of the platforms and maintenance and then those kinds of operations. But if you're looking kind of maybe down the road, long term, if a market develops on the West Coast, that we could really be a hub for that kind of development. It's something that's happened for harbors in Europe, similar to ours, where maybe they're a little underutilized, you might say, and that creates an opportunity for companies to come in and use it as a staging location for not just projects off of our coast, but for the rest of California or north or anywhere kind of in the Pacific. And there's been a number of studies, that like the federal government has done, looking at like what harbors on the West Coast really are well suited to this. And other than the fact that, you know, we need some dock upgrades, Humble Bay kind of checks all the boxes. One of the key ones is vertical draft. So the way these are put together is you typically have, you know, the platform, and then you assemble the wind turbine, you know, on the platform, and then tugboat it out, you know, fully assembled, and ballast it once you get in place and hook it up to the mooring lines and the cable. And you know, these things are pretty gigantic. They're like 600 feet tall, so you can't fit one under the Golden Gate Bridge. So doing it anywhere in Oakland or San Francisco is a non-starter. And so, you know, the fact that we don't have a bridge between where the docking would be and being able to take things in and out of the harbor is a key feature that we have that many other harbors don't have. So I think that's one of the areas, and you know, this doesn't take a railroad. These parts are very large, you know, and so they're coming and going by sea, and so there isn't a constraint as far as, you know, needing that capacity to be able to do this locally. So it's something that can happen, you know, in the next few years, you know, as we go through this process, hopefully, and then build on that as things progress on the West Coast. So, you know, this is just an example of, you know, kind of these components all come in by barge, and you'll have these kinds of staging areas where you do the assembly. Down the road, if there's really a big industry, you could have some of that manufacturing done locally, but, you know, if we're talking about a project of, like, you know, maybe 10, 15 turbines, and so, you know, you're not going to manufacture those just for 10 units locally, so you'd be bringing in components and then doing the assembly locally, potentially the fabrication of the platforms locally. So where we're at, we're just in the stages of finalizing a public-private partnership agreement to get things going with those development partners. We're going to be submitting an offshore lease application, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the federal agency that leases federal waters. And so we'll be submitting a lease request through the process they have to hopefully get a site off of Humboldt. And we're looking at a site that's about 24, 25 to 30 miles off the coast of Eureka, so pretty far out. You know, as far as like visual impacts, if you go to Trinidad Head and you look at like the Samoa pulp mill smokestack, that's about 20 so miles from Trinidad Head, and that's like 300 feet tall. So, you know, if you can't see it on most days because it's pretty far away, but that would give you a sense of kind of like put that smokestack, you know, that far from Trinidad Head out into the ocean. You know, so it'll be pretty far out, and that also helps reduce you know, impacts to commercial fishing and wildlife, which are probably the two main factors that we're really working to work with local fishermen as well as work with you know, environmental groups as we move through this process to try to make sure that we minimize and mitigate impacts on those fronts. We're figuring out the grid interconnection of how to get the power, you know, into the broader California grid, and, you know, how to intertie that. That's a couple-year process. As far as getting to shore, it basically would be a buried undersea cable that would come in and then come ashore and connect to the broader grid from the project. And then we're going to be working on a port infrastructure assessment to figure out, okay, what level of upgrades do we need, how do we want to pay for those to move this forward. So that's kind of a quick overview of where we're at, and we're, you know, in the very early stages of this process. It's probably at least, you know, if everything goes as quickly as possible, it'll be a 6 year or so working through the lease application, the interconnection study, all the technical work, all the environmental review. You know, there's about 4 or 5 steps of, you know, if you get the lease, that's not permission to build it. That's like, then you submit a plan for how you're going to study it, and then if you get that plan approved, then you can do the studies, and then once the studies are complete, then you do a, you know, construction operation plan that needs to be approved. And so there's quite a lot of steps, and then it's going from federal waters onto state waters onto the shore, so it's like every single possible permitting agency that exists has to approve this. So we'll be at that for a while. But you know, so far we've been getting a lot of positive responses from state agencies and federal agencies and local community groups. So we're optimistic that we'll be able to kind of grind through this whole process and move things forward.
So when I think of Southern California, my family's in Palm Springs, there's a huge forest of them, of these turbines. How many would you envision being out there?
Yeah, so when you're thinking of, like, you know, when you see them on shore, the difference is the offshore turbines are dramatically larger because they don't have the constraints. And so even onshore, like the early generations where you see like Altamont Pass, where there's all these like little fast-fitting ones, and there's like, you know, hundreds of them, that those are, been slowly but surely replaced by bigger turbines, so bigger, fewer turbines basically that are farther apart. And there's, efficiency gains from that as far as the larger turbines are more, they produce more energy per unit cost. And then also they're not quite as visually overwhelming because you've got, instead of like 10 little ones, you've got, one big one that's just sitting there. And so these ones that are offshore, because there isn't those constraints of trying to have things that can fit on a truck or fit on a rail car, they're typically much larger. Like, I said, they can be, the modern turbines are like starting to be like 10 megawatts, which a typical like modern onshore turbine is like 1 megawatt. So they're larger, and so we're talking about like maybe 10, 12 turbines that would be out 20, 30 miles off the coast, so not like a forest of these things. But like I said, they're very tall. They're like the height of like the Golden Gate Bridge size, so you've got a few of these big structures that are out there instead of those big kind of clusters of small ones.
How far apart, so what's the footprint?
They're about a mile apart is usually kind of, it has to do with how, like their rotor diameter to not have like basically the turbulence from one impacting the other. So you'd have like a row of 10 of these about a mile apart.
Are they bidirectional or?
Yeah, so they'll adjust to depending on what direction the wind's going. Yeah.
So the cable is going to be in the ground. I mean, it's
yeah. So the cable would, there'd be a cable connecting them out there at the farm, and then it would go down to the seafloor and then be buried and go across the seafloor to shore.
So there's potential of 10 cables.
No, it'd be one cable coming in. Yeah. So they would group together to like an offshore substation, and then one cable would come on.
But you're still going to have those subsequent ones to lead up there.
Yeah, so let's say you've got them in a row of 10, there would be a cable that would go between them, and then that would go to shore.
Right.
So they'd be connected to each. It wouldn't be necessarily it wouldn't be like a hub and spoke. It would be like a daisy chain of them then going to shore.
If you're an energy authority, I assume you look at all the energy possibilities. Quite a while ago, they were talking about the wave or tide generated ones go up and down. Because one thing we got out there, I'm a fisherman, we got a lot of swells. Every 4 seconds today.
And so the wave and wind generation potential are it's not a coincidence that we have both. Obviously, they're related. There's definitely the possibility of wave energy generation. The technology for wave generation is still in kind of the early R&D stages, whereas offshore wind is commercially happening. I mean, there's hundreds of these turbines in Europe, and so that's where, not that there isn't that wave potential, but right now there's still just a few projects that have one device that they're trying to get tested and developed, as opposed to it being something that can actually be commercially deployed. Yeah.
What's the current thinking about the impact of bird populations and the fact that they're way out in the ocean? Would that reduce that impact?
Yeah, so I'm not a biologist, but the folks we've talked to have generally said, the farther out you go, the fewer species, the less impacts you're going to have. But it's not that there's no birds out there, and it is also a little more challenging to study what the impacts are when you're that far out. It's not like something on shore where you can just have a grad student hang out underneath it and walk around and see if there's any dead birds and and sit there with binoculars. So there's actually H.G. Harvey and Associates, one of their big areas of focus is what's the technology necessary to assess the impacts for these kinds of projects, and so luckily we're not the first to be doing this, so there's a lot of work that's going on. But I will say that's one of the areas that's a key concern is, okay, we've got to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's minimizing impacts, both to birds as well as marine mammals. Although the cables for these things are like this big, so that the anchor cables aren't like an entanglement risk for a whale. Although you could have fishing gear that got caught on a cable, and then the whale could get entangled in that. And so having systems in place to mitigate that is important. Yeah.
A couple of related questions. Obviously, you've got to get the energy to where it's needed, right? So is there any talk of local storage, battery or other, and also in terms of transmission out of the area, are you also looking at the other projects that are happening, like the Scotia Bridgeville tie-in and things like that?
Yeah, so definitely, and and that's one of the reasons, so the scale that we're looking at would be the target is to not need to upgrade the transmission lines all the way to the central valley. you know, if there's, and that's where the study process kind of looks at, you know, what are other projects, what are the interactions of those, how does that impact, you know, how much power can go on the grid locally, and so there's like a 2-year state process that we'll go through that'll say, okay, this is how much you can actually put on the grid, what are the constraints to that. Storage is becoming one option to help, you know, integrate, you know, more renewable energy generation, so that if, you know, it's not synced up to quite the right time, you can adjust that with battery storage. We're actually looking at that for the project we're doing up at the airport. And Coast Guard Station is putting in a large Tesla battery system with solar that will be able to do that sort of triage of, you know, balancing the grid needs and you know, wholesale power prices to what the output of the solar array is, and then that project will have the added benefit of, if the grid goes down, we'll be able to power the Coast Guard and the airport off of solar and battery pretty much indefinitely. So it'll add some emergency response resiliency capabilities and redundant backup out there at the airport. So, yeah.
How much would the wind power generated cost as compared to the energy that we currently get? And then with the supply of energy like that, does that open up any kind of new economic markets here locally outside of the manufacturing and installation of?
Yeah, so the first project, it probably won't be like the cheapest, you know, electricity on the market right off the bat. You know, so one of the things that, you know, that's a question that's crucial, because like, okay, if the prices can't get competitive, then it's gonna, you know, it's not gonna take off. Now, I will say in Europe, and actually, you know, in Europe, the prices have been coming down where they're starting to have, you know, basically unsubsidized offshore wind projects that can just compete on the open market with other resources. And then back east, they just got a big project that was awarded in Massachusetts, and the price that came in at was like below other renewable prices on the East Coast, and it was like way below what people thought was going to be the bid price that would actually be, you know, the winning bid for that project. And so the prices are coming down, and so we'll see where this one falls. This is the first round, but certainly, you know, as far as the sort of economic potential of it, you know, our involvement in this, you know, we're expecting to be a power off-taker, but we're not thinking we're necessarily going to be the only person buying power for the project. So there is potential for that to be kind of, you know, a market opportunity, if you will. Yeah.
What are the conditions on the permit? Just basically as far as access and also what sort of impact does it have on the marine life situation? I would imagine there's a lot of life around those.
Yeah, so in some cases, they'll, you know, there's positive impacts in that, you know, they can be an artificial reef. Now, this far out, I think that'll be less of a factor, but, you know, like the project in Rhode Island that went in, like, there's a lot of sport fishing because they've created a reef structure that, you know, grows barnacles and mussels that fish like that, and so, you know, they actually take, you know, fishing trips out to that project now because it's an artificial reef. But, you know, the BOEM process basically is, you know, the federal agency that like leases it, and then you go through the permitting processes with all the agencies that have to approve that. It is, I will say, just a lease for offshore wind. It's not like you can piggyback offshore oil or anything onto that, because BOEM is also the one that does leasing for offshore oil and gas, but there are different processes, and, you know, it's not like you can, you know, combine the two into one lease application, so they're mutually exclusive processes. As far as the wildlife impacts, you know, I think, you know, seabirds is probably the key one, and then, you know, whales would be the other. You know, there's benefits of doing floating projects compared to the fixed bottom one, because one of the impacts to whales is when they're putting these in and they're driving these piles for these projects, that can be, you know, acoustically disruptive, whereas this is just an anchoring system. It's also easier to take out, so after a 25-year, let's say, life cycle of the project, unlike having something that you've, you know, attached to the seafloor, which is a lot harder to get out, this just has anchor cables that you can, you know, pull up and you can tugboat the whole thing in, and you know, this picture is actually from them decommissioning it. So that was one of the things they wanted to prove with that first Portugal project, was that, oh, you can put this in, you can operate it, you can also take it out easily, you know, and it's easy to decommission it for, you know, after the life of the project. And so they operated it for about 5 years, and this is when they're taking it apart. Now they wet stored that platform, so they sunk it off the coast of Portugal to store it, you know, just to get it out of the way. And then for their Scottish project, they actually brought it back up, scraped it off, and then they sent it to Scotland, and I think it actually is up and running in Scotland now. So they're pretty durable in that sense as far as the platform itself. They obviously detached the turbine and took that apart, but then the platform they sunk and stored underwater.
So what's the typical lifespan then of one of these?
Yeah, so it's like 25 years is usually like the lifespan of a project, for wind projects, so after that 25-year period, it would either be taken out, decommissioned, or you might repower it and put new turbines, renew the lease or something if it was, if that made sense at the time.
How long has this been on your drawing board locally, and how has enthusiasm at the federal level changed?
Yeah, so it's been in kind of our long-term planning efforts. It was like, hey, we've got this great offshore wind resource as well as wave energy generation potential, and it was sort of like, but the technology's not really there. It's still kind of in the R&D stage, and so it's really the last couple years is when it started to say, okay, it's going out of the R&D stage in Europe into the actual commercial stage when we said, oh, we should take another look at that. So about 2 years ago, we actually said, we should start investigating seriously the potential to do this. And then that really picked up as the federal government started realizing that this was something that was a real potential. And I would say the industry realized it before, like the state of California and even the federal government, and that there was an unsolicited lease request down off of Morro Bay, and and I think the state and the federal government started saying, oh wait, companies actually are ready to start doing this, and we're kind of behind the game, and so they're kind of scrambling to get their ducks in a row. Conversely, on the East Coast, it's really kind of taken off, and it's well underway to kind of start catching up with Europe in that regard. So we've been at it for a couple years, and I think we're seeing in the last year and a half the state and federal governments sort of say, oh, okay, this is something that really is going to happen. So we've had folks from BOEM and the state come up here several times now and meet with us, meet with local fishermen, to start kind of realizing that this is a potential.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. We're going to Foundation in your name. Great. So thank you. I appreciate the show. So while I switch this real quick, raffle. We have the raffle ready.
Well, one quick announcement real quick. If you come to the races today, bring a chair.
Yeah.
And layer. It might not be as warm and beautiful sunny, but the sun's been trying to come out.
It's going to be warm and beautiful sunny. I put in the order for it earlier, so. And everybody knows, you gotta listen to me, right?
3:07 is the first race.
Oh, it's not.
No, it's
481072. 072.
They're in the back.
All right.
I don't know that a red badge is allowed to pull the blue ball, so it's not gonna happen.
Zero 6-8.
068.
068. Remember the rule. All right, now my favorite part of the meeting. Number 311. It's just going to keep dropping. It gets closer. It's going to be like me. I'm going to get closer and closer every week. You should start sitting in the back. So
I'm working on it.
Yeah. I noticed you moved. You're like, they gave me this too. Apparently, I think that I should be done. All right. I'm not really sure about this, but I think this is a good quote to end on because it kind of feels like the way this is going. So,